Well, welcome again to our ongoing series of the Dean's Forums this year. This one in particular is connected with Lloyd and Jean Cowland Endowment, established in 2000 with the goal of promoting Christian dialogue over issues of cultural significance for us. Made possible, the endowment was by family and friends of Dr. and Mrs. Lloyd Cowland. Dr. Cowland, longtime professor at Gordon-Conwell of Christian ethics. Also, even as we were talking around the table at lunch here, there were very few things that Lloyd did not do around the seminary. He was the COO on occasion. He was the CEO on occasion. He was the dean on occasion. He was, in many ways, a Renaissance-like figure here at Gordon-Conwell, beloved and long time. And his partner, his life partner, Jean, also was an ever, almost omnipresent individual here at Gordon-Conwell as well, speaking into student family issues with great regularity, a great heart for hospitality. And so we are grateful to the endowment that enables us to continue this great tradition. 2 years ago, in advance of the election, the national election, the Cowland Endowment funded us the ability to speak about what it means to be a Christian in a contemporary democracy. And so we talked about, with Tim Sherritt, a friend over at Gordon College, to think Christianly about political engagement. Last year, one of our own board members, the Reverend Dr. Samuel Rodriguez, was with us and spoke into the issues of immigration reform. And we looked in particular at the impact upon migration, upon the mission of the church. And so this year we are just thrilled to have with us Dr. Anthony Bradley, as I introduced him a little bit earlier, professor of theology and ethics at the King's College in New York City, a fellow of the Acton Institute, and a public intellectual in the best sense of that word. He is speaking into a variety of forums in relatively provocative and, I think, unique ways, even as we listened earlier this morning. Covenant Seminary, Westminster Theological Seminary, means that he knows who we are here inside of evangelicalism. But in many ways, as he has titled the last book of his, Aliens in the Promised Land, there is nonetheless in which he speaks as a African-American into a largely Anglo movement and a distinctive voice on that. And so we've asked Dr. Bradley if he might speak about issues of confession and race and the gospel this afternoon. And as is our custom, we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. And so with a warm welcome again, lend a hand to bringing Dr. Bradley here to the podium. Thanks, buddy. Oh, that put you up there.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction again. And I'm delighted to come and have the opportunity to speak about these issues. If anyone has read or followed me on social media or read in my books, you know that this is a particular issue for me that's near and dear to my heart and my bank account as well. Someone sent me a message on Facebook and said, thank you for incessantly talking about race. And you're welcome. Right? I guess I should say that. You're welcome to that. And he seemed surprised that I talk about race, and I said, well, I've got several books on this topic. This is kind of what I do for a living, right? So, at any rate, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm delighted and honored to be here for this lecture series. What I'd like to do is I want us to talk. Can we just talk? Is that all right? So I want to throw out some of my current ideas. This is fresh stuff you're getting. Okay. So feel free to push back if you'd like. I want to talk about just a few ideas on this in the discourse in terms of race and the gospel and the church. And then I want us to have a fairly robust Q&A time together. Of course, my introduction to these issues come really on the heels of me entering into evangelicalism, having come from a very traditional African-American black church / a liberation theology church background. I was raised in the United Methodist Church in Atlanta. I was raised in a church that became predominantly African-American. My parents were of a generation of Atlantans that left the city after desegregation and moved to the suburbs with a whole host of middle class and upper middle class black professionals. So I was raised in a context of men and women who were actually friends of MLK and went to Morehouse and Spelman with him, and were in fraternities and sororities. I mean, I'm an alpha, of course, right? And some of you will get that later. Mom's a Delta, so Delta, AKA is Q's. I mean, this is sort of my context. The Cosby Show for me was not fiction. These are the kinds of people that I grew up with. Right? So I went to Clemson University and had never been around evangelicals before. And it actually transpired in part because they became friends of mine. We lived in the same hall, and I got invited to something called FCA. I didn't know what that was. And I got invited to something called RUF, Reformed University Fellowship. I didn't know what that was. I didn't really care. The only thing I knew was some friends asked me to go to something with a lot of people. And as an extrovert, I'm down for that. Right? And so I walk in a room, and there's people, playing guitars and wearing flip-flops, and and it's January, and they got on shorts. I'm just trying to figure out, what are these people really about? And it was sort of as I was brought into community in terms of friendship. And when I left at Clemson University and enrolled in the Covenant Seminary, I didn't really know what I was getting into. And it was after I sort of crossed over and really entered head first into the evangelical space as a student that things changed. I began to learn some history that I hadn't learned before, didn't know about. And it was only after I became a seminary professor at Covenant years later that I really understood in different ways when I got called the N-word several times and was told I had an affirmative action PhD from Westminster. And I'm thinking, I didn't have affirmative action comps. I promise you that. Not those 2 days. I cried when I passed my German exam. I did. I cried because I was, yeah. So I got called all these really bad names by Christians in the years when I enrolled, when I became a seminary professor, because it was sort of known, what is he doing here? Right? I mean, those people, that's for urban ministry, not for leadership. I mean, these are people we help. Right? So that's when everything changed. And so my radar really went on in a different way. And as I began to dig around more and more, I began to see that perhaps the conversation we're having isn't the best one. That is, I'm becoming more convinced that we talk a lot about race when we actually should be talking about class. And I say that because if you look at American history, our deepest divisions in this country have been on the basis of class, and race has been used as a way to put people within certain classes. And if you want a good example of this, just have to read a couple books. One is Not Quite White by Matt Ray, and Working Toward Whiteness, last name Roediger. And you'll see that if you were Scot-Irish or German or Polish, for example, you didn't become white until World War II. Up until that point, you were not quite white. You were just other. And in part, what we ought to be talking about really is not simply about race, but otherness. That is, how does the kingdom and the gospel, how is it that issues related to the imago Dei and loving God and loving neighbor apply to otherness? What we've done in this country, particularly among the elite, is manufactured and reconstructed multiple ways to put people in the group known as other. And we've used race to do that, we've used class to do that, we've used gender to do that, to sort of put them in the category of not like us. Part of the American story, of course, is African chattel slavery, right? We all are fairly familiar with the African slave trade. But there's also the Irish slave trade. That in the mid-16th century, hundreds of thousands of Irish were put on ships and sent to the Caribbean as white slaves. And that slavery was actually more likened to today's bonded labor slavery. They were working alongside slaves in the Caribbean and also here in the Southeast because they weren't white people either. The only true white people were those who were descendants of the British. And unless you were of British descent, you weren't really one of us. If you look back at the American story, there is a story of two kinds of white people. Elite white people and the white underclass. And if you look on a map, you can map this out. The Ulster Scots settled between, right along the Appalachian Trail, right? So from Maine all the way down through Kentucky and West Virginia, all the way down through North Georgia, on west, North Alabama, North Mississippi, Tennessee, etc., and that they were historically marginalized by those people who had settled on the coast who were mainly of British descent and from the Church of England. The Ulster Scots, the Presbyterians, and the Anglicans over here didn't get along because the same tensions that the British had with the Ulster Scots in what is now the UK, they exported those same tensions over here. And so, redneck and cracker and lubber and white trash, those were designations that were promulgated by the white elites to put lower class whites in a category of otherness. And what you had, particularly during the mid 18th century through Jim Crow, until Jim Crow started, you had freed slaves, freed blacks, Native Americans. In Mississippi, in the 1830s, you had Chinese, all and white trash, lubbers, dirt eaters. They were all part of the same communities. They would live in the same communities. They would work together. Why? Because they were all not white people. And that's a narrative about whiteness in this country that has been primarily about class, not skin colorism. And we have been, I believe, too distracted by skin colorism, and it has put us in positions, I believe, where we are missing the true core issue that divides us. So we talk a lot about race, but we don't talk enough about class, because our discussions about race always are about the intersections of race and class. In fact, intersectionality and hybridity are probably better categories to talk about these issues because we're all hybrids of race and class and gender. I mean, I haven't benefited from white privilege, but I've benefited from class privilege. I have a great credit rating. I'm not bragging, I'm just saying I have because my parents raised me to do that. So I have opportunity to get loans and all sorts of things that some of my cousins can't get. And some of my friends can't get because they asked me to co-sign. On their loans, which I will not do, right? I mean, I believe in the resurrection, and I most definitely believe in the blood of Christ, but it doesn't cover that kind of stuff, right? not co-signing on things like that. So I have been a beneficiary of class privilege to some extent, but it's been undermined by race. Right? And so our discussions on this issue have to always involve the intersections of race and class. And so what I've seen in the evangelical space over the last 20 years of being in these discussions is white evangelicals who want to get involved in these issues don't sort of throw class out the window. They aren't even aware of class, it seems to me. So what happens is you have these self-congratulatory white people who are in diverse churches of people who have different color, but they're all the same class. That is a white church. So if a church is full of Latinos and Asians and blacks, and they're all of the same class, that is a white church. And it is a white church historically because they all have the same disposition toward true groups of people. They don't care about underclass and lower class whites ever. And they tend to have a more paternalistic disposition toward Latinos and blacks. So there was a history in missions. You may have heard the term civilizing missions, where not only would they bring the gospel, but they would also bring culture and etiquette and social values and things like that. And what I've seen over the years are evangelicals who often engage in urban ministry for the purpose of civilizing missions. We're going to bring them the gospel, but we're also going to make them like us. And what that has done, what I've seen over the years, has done one main thing. I've never seen a context of urban ministry where there were white evangelicals involved in reaching the black underclass or Latino underclass, where black and Latino leaders were raised up out of that. I've never seen that. I've never seen leaders emerge out of that. I've seen followers emerge out of that, but not leaders emerge out of that. And so today, my chief concern is this. Why is it that there is a disposition whereby people who are all concerned about justice and helping the poor restrict that to people of color, when factually, most of the nation's poor, by definition, in terms of numbers, are actually poor white people? That poor white people actually comprise most of the welfare payouts in this country. It is poor white people. But it is a white underclass that is off the radar of our justice discourse. And I believe that and again, this is conjecture, but as I look at the literature, it seems that in part that has a long history. A long history of elite Protestants, waspy Protestants, who have always wanted to distance themselves from the white underclass. They're much more willing to avail themselves in a paternalistic way to blacks and Latinos, but they're less interested in availing themselves to helping poor people regardless of their race or their class. Regardless of their race. There are particular kinds of people who qualify as beneficiaries of help, but not those people. not white trash, not crackers, not lubbers, not dirt eaters, not those people. And so I've been on this crusade of sorts to try to figure out why this is. Why is it that we tend to be self-congratulatory when we define diversity along one axis with skin color, and we don't define diversity along the axis of class? If your church is not diverse by class, you are not doing Galatians 3:28. Don't even refer to the verse. Right? The verse, if you read the verse, right, it actually talks about, it includes different classes of people. Right? Masters and slaves. Those are different classes of people in terms of economic class. So we have to do a better job, I argue, in terms of mixing up this discourse, introducing these intersections of race and class, if we want to make the type of progress that I believe loving God and loving neighbor compels us to take, and the type of progress that I believe the gospel forces us to take. We can't simply settle with skin colorism as a measure of how we're doing. For years, I've asked church planners, hey, who are all about justice, right? Well, are you interested in planting a church near a trailer park? You hear crickets. Well, why not? Are you interested in going to Appalachia to serve people there? Crickets. Well, why is that? Are you interested in going to rural Montana and Oklahoma and North Dakota to care for those people, to love them and serve them? Crickets. Why is that? Now, in part, one of the reasons that I have such concerns about those people, that is, if you look historically at the history of the Ku Klux Klan was primarily comprised of the lower white classes. And it was because they felt completely marginalized by elite whites that they took up arms to rid themselves of the competition, which were Jews, right? Jewish immigrants and blacks and Greeks and Catholics, because they were completely ignored. There's a great documentary out on PBS, American Experience, Klan USA. And during the during the Civil Rights Movement in North Carolina, there was a resurgence of the Klan. And the leader of the Klan in North Carolina basically said this: no one is speaking up for the poor white man. No one is speaking up for the working class white guy. Who is our voice? And the Klan said, we will be your voice against those elitists who have a history of calling you guys white trash and crackers and rednecks. Until we begin to unpack and dissect this discussion and include and introduce some new intersections, I just don't believe that we're going to get as far as we'd like to, because we have to talk about otherness. Because when the discussion is about otherness, then it's transnational. It's not simply about black-white issues in this country, because every country in the world has an otherness problem. And so when we expand the category to how is it that we step into the tensions between the dominant culture and the others, then we can have the type of model that's exportable, the type of discussion that that represents the transnational nature of the scriptures themselves. So the work I'm currently doing in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and excuse me, because when I talk about Northern Ireland, my voice kind of changes for some reason. So forgive me for that. But I've been going to Northern Ireland for quite some time. The last couple of years, I'll be back this summer, because I'm working with a team of people who are trying to reconcile Catholics and Protestants, because Those are actually considered not just religious divisions, but they're almost races of people. If you talk to lads in Belfast who are Protestants, they can tell you, they can look and tell if someone's Catholic by the way they walk. They have Catholic facial features and things like that. Because this is about otherness, not simply about skin colorism. And so we have to do a better job of moving and advancing the conversation beyond some of those very, very clear, I would say almost too easy divisions that are simply cosmetic. If you look at the history, these are the things that exactly made Protestants vulnerable to being promoters of eugenics. During the Progressive Era, between 1870 and World War II, Protestants were largely involved, to my surprise and a lot of the surprise of other people, they were largely involved in the promotion of eugenics. How did that happen? You had a group of Protestants who, and we're talking about Anglicans and Presbyterians and especially the Congregationalists, who were concerned about social transformation. And they believed that the fundamentalists were off the reservation because they focused primarily on saving souls. And they thought that the gospel compelled us to transform society and culture. And so it opened them up to being enamored by science. Science is going to save us. Science will provide the answer for social transformation. Why do we have the pathologies that we do in the country around 1900? It's because of germplasm issues. People had bad genes, and science was going to be our savior, and the extent to which we learned more and more about germplasm and genes, and we could transform societies. And so they were preaching competitions in New York City and in Chicago where pastors were involved in inserting science to promote eugenics, that you had these elite Christians who put lower class people in the category of feeble-mindedness. White trash and rednecks and crackers were feeble-minded. And for the gospel and for the kingdom, they would argue, we need to forcibly sterilize white women, feeble-minded white women. And so for several decades, about 100 years ago, over 8,000 white women were forcibly sterilized. What were the Christians doing? Giving their blessing to it. Why? Because they were feeble-minded. They were other. And what happened over time is that expanded itself later on into black context. And some of that eugenics didn't end until the mid-1970s, but it was initially started because these elites wanted to control the reproduction of those other people. And it was the fundamentalists who were actually the ones that balked the most about eugenics. And what happened is that the people had blinders on completely because they were so caught up in social transformation, so caught up in the emergence of science, and so caught up in their cultural elitism that they were willing to actually sanction and promote the injustice of people that they considered not quite white, non-human, the other people. Now, as that, of course, expanded to African Americans, it continued to go underground. But there was a Supreme Court case in I believe it was 1924, Buck versus Bell, where Oliver Wendell Holmes, that great Supreme Court justice that conservatives love, he said this at the end of his opinion. He said, "We've had 3 generations of those imbeciles. That's enough. 3 generations of those imbeciles, that's enough." And that's when the widespread forced sterilization of underclass white women went supranational. Now, because we don't pay attention, because we have our preferred other groups, we often miss the systematic oppression of groups that we don't prefer. And so this conversation about race and class must extend beyond what we believe, what we see on the surface. We've got to dig deeper. We've got to do the type of surgery that, well, not just surgery, we have to be as culturally subversive as Christ was. Christ transcended race and class. What happened in the church in Galatia transcended race and class. We can't be satisfied with simply cosmetically having something that looks a certain way when in fact it's a variation on the same theme of creating a new type of other, a new type of us versus them. So if we care about the poor, if we care about justice, if we care about mercy, if we care about the application of the gospel to all of these things, then we have to care about the applications of those to every people and person group, every tribe, tongue, and nation all over the world that is suffering from oppression no matter what, whether we prefer them or not. I fundamentally say this as I close, and I'll take some questions. For my white evangelical friends, I simply say this: if you have not demonstrated that you can love the poor white people in your own community, don't talk to me about going to the hood, because I'm assuming that your motives then must be about something else. If you drive past a trailer park to get to the hood, something's wrong, right? That you can, and when I was in St. Louis, I saw those people that drive right past trailer parks to get in the inner city of St. Louis to do like real ministry with people who are needy. Something is categorically wrong with that. I've also never seen in 20 years of the types of intersections where evangelicals have sort of moved into minority neighborhoods. I've never seen a neighborhood in the long run that was better off for blacks and Hispanics when whites moved in. I've never seen that. I've seen white people be better off in the long run, but I've never seen a community that was better off for the minority residents in those communities. And many of us wonder if, in fact, that's a consequence of not being culturally aware enough of the challenges that come when we bring one class of people into another class of people, and how the marketplace responds specifically to that. So this discussion for me, again, is not simply about race. It's about race and class. And if class is not on your radar, then I'm going to submit that race shouldn't be either. Let me take your questions.
As we've come to expect, when Dr. Bradley's in the house, there's lots of questions. And so, not a sermon, but a question. So let's dive in. We've got Dr. Bradley for a little more time. Who wants to start us off? There's some microphones around the room. Marcus?
Thank you so much. This is really helpful, what you're pointing out, especially for our ministry as the church. I'd like to ask a question clarifying what you see happening maybe outside the church, the role of racism and the role of classism when it comes to policing and our justice system in Missouri, but also all over our country. Do you think that it's fair to say skin colorism is the maybe primary problem there, or should this be looked at through a lens of classism?
Right, that's a great question. Again, it's a combination of both. So I actually own a house within the school district where Ferguson is, and it's the Normandy School District, the worst school district in the state of Missouri. They lost their accreditation, and that's a neighborhood that transitioned. That neighborhood used to be kind of lower middle class and middle class whites. and blacks moved in, and the whites left. But the police department stayed white. And that's a narrative that we've seen in other parts of the country, where the transitions happened, but the police department actually stayed white. Now, what's interesting, in my township, which is right next to it in the same school district, in Veneta Park, when we got a black mayor, this is a true story, he actually fired most of the white cops, just got rid of them, and hired a bunch of black ones, because the neighborhood is like 60% black. To sort of avoid the kinds of things that happened right down the street in Ferguson. So what I would want to challenge us to stop doing is listing these issues in terms of primary, secondary, tertiary. I think that's part of the problem, is that we're trying to get to like the issue, or the first issue, or like the most important issue before we can get to all the other issues. And I'm going to submit that these are all simultaneously the issues. And so how do we talk about policing that can flesh out the growing tensions between white working class cops and black middle class communities that involve the historical narrative of both race and class in those areas? That actually will help us arrive at better solutions to the issues, because the issues in Ferguson are issues of race and class. They're reasons why there is a level of resentment and tension among the white working class and the black middle class and the black underclass in those areas. And insofar as we're able to unpack the history of that along those axes, we can actually arrive at much better solutions that are also going to transcend both race and class. That impulse, I understand it. We're post-Enlightenment Christians. We list things, right? We do catechisms that have a number 1, 2, 3. But the world of the New Testament is Greek. It's fluid. It's all a bunch of Venn diagrams and circles and yin and yang. I mean, it's much more fluid than that. But we are too static on these issues. And I think that's part of our problem, is that we want to find the primary one, and it distracts us from all the others, because we think that, well, if we don't get the first one right, then we won't get the rest of them right. And I'm going to argue, well, we have to sort of work at getting and addressing them all at the same time, not just particularly one. Yeah, great question.
Let me jump in as well, and then we'll bring Zach in. You've done a lot of thinking about millennials, and
yes.
Part of our public discourse is that millennials bump into diversity more comfortably than the boomers.
Well, unless you're at the University of Oklahoma, but that's a different question. But go ahead.
So that was my question.
Yeah.
Is that, in fact, the case? That is our discourse about diversity changing
Right.
across the generations?
That's a great question. Are you familiar with the contact hypothesis? Anyone familiar with that? Gordon, last name is Alport, A-L-P-R-T. It essentially came out in the late 1960s. The contact hypothesis, which basically says this: putting a bunch of people of different races in a room together doesn't really do anything. Right? That just sort of having people share space together, sort of being in proximity, doesn't actually change anyone's views. There actually has to be something that forces them to engage in real mutuality. That's what changes people's views. And until we actually can create context where that mutuality actually happens, it's just cosmetic. It's just decorating a Christmas tree with a bunch of races. And then we look at how diverse we are, because and we take pictures and we do PowerPoint presentations, we do pamphlets and raise money off of that. But we're not really digging into the core issues whereby our relationships are different. Our wedding photos are different. The people to whom we repent and the people to whom we submit for leadership, those things have to be different. In my book, Aliens in the Promised Land, that's a plug, Lance Lewis, who is a pastor in the PCA, has been in the PCA for, probably 25, 26 years now. African-American pastor says, moratorium on whites doing anything with black people. Just stop it. No more white people trying to plant churches. No more multicultural. Just stay away. And people are like, oh my gosh, why is he saying that? He's saying this. He's saying this because what he's found is that when whites have not had to sit under the leadership of blacks, they're actually not equipped to understand the issues to preach to when they enter into those contexts. Because the sort of deep, beyond the visceral stuff doesn't happen until there's mutuality. And so millennials, you're exactly right. They often share spaces with lots of different races. They actually experience diversity in lots of different ways. But the core of their relationships are the same. That really hasn't changed, right? And so in the context of this, of what happened in Oklahoma, I know I wasn't surprised, right? Because that's the kind of stuff. I mean, when I was at Clemson, I got called, some of my sort of drunken frat friends would tell me after they've had a couple or several Bud Lights, they say, hey man, you're a good nigger, right? This is Clemson, South Carolina. You're a good nigger. I'm like, oh, okay. You're not like those other ones, but you're a good one, man. We're so glad you're here because you're a good nigger, right? Now, what am I supposed to do? I'm not going to do anything because I'm around a bunch of people who are drunk saying that. Right? But we are hanging out and being friends, and my presence with them, that changed nothing. I did have another friend at Clemson that he told me this after 4 years of our friendship, when we graduated. He told me that he was a racist, and it was only after us being friends for 4 years that he stopped being a racist. And we had hung out, we had drinking some adult beverages together. I had been in his parents' house for, dozens and dozens and dozens of times, but he was still had these issues, and it wasn't until we were in a relationship that actually changed. So I find that millennials often share multi-ethnic space, but because that contact doesn't demand mutuality, not much has changed, and we stop there. We are happy with the cosmetics and don't do things that cut us deeper.
Amen. Zach.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Very much appreciated. One of the things that, we're all coming into the conversation at different platforms, different places, right?
Yes.
And so, for me, it has been up and coming, but nonetheless, 100% am seeing racial reconciliation, even this idea that you're now presenting with class,
Yes.
as being related to the gospel foundational within it.
Yes.
When I seek in my family and in my church and even in my class and amongst my friends, as I'm trying to persuade them of this, I normally get a lot of pushback with where is this sort of ministry, even that you're presenting now, where is that in the scriptures of being a primary thing we need to be concerning ourselves with? Like, where are the imperatives? Like, they understand the indicatives. These are good reformed, I'm amongst the same people that you
Sure.
were. They're saying, oh yeah, creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. Yeah, we see it all, nations, tribes, people, tongue.
Sure.
But those are just the indicatives. Where's the imperative? And then that's one. And the other one is, did Paul do that in his ministry? Did he concern himself as much as what Anthony Bradley is, with these issues?
Sure.
So that's the pushback on me as I seek to make this an issue that we need to, even primarily in our context, be dealing with. They push back on me and say, I don't see that being a primary issue in the scriptures, nor do I see an imperative that I must do it.
Right, that's a great question. And what I found with my friends who push back and have those sorts of issues, have those same sorts of questions, what I found really helpful for them is to talk about loving your neighbor as a way of opening them out to possibilities of new relationships and contexts for the sake of the gospel and the kingdom, right? Because what happens, I mean, this whole discussion about white privilege, what I found is it tends to put white people on the defensive, right? Oh, here we go, that word. So what I've recently said is if you're white and you have privilege, celebrate it. Like, own it. Wear it, embrace it. Get a T-shirt. I have white, like, get a tattoo, like, right? There's no shame. There's no shame, right? Because the question is, why do you have it? And it's for the purpose of loving God and neighbor that you have opportunities now to do things for other people that you couldn't do before, right? It's an asset, so use it for the purpose of loving somebody who doesn't have those privileges and things like that. So I've found more success in changing the conversation and keeping it in the category of loving your neighbor and asking them, especially if they have evangelistic impulses, right? What does it mean for you to love the people who are around you? And why is it that you love some people and don't love other people? It's one of the reasons why I've been talking about lower-class white people, because it actually raises a different consciousness. Now there's a new awareness. Well, maybe we are doing something wrong, right? So I've raised it with a lot of my friends to say, hey, listen, and they're like, no, I'm good, man. I don't have any division. I'm like, well, how come you make fun of your redneck cousins? You make fun of them. Right? You mock them. I mean, at a lot of evangelical campuses, they'll have like redneck and white trash parties. They would never have, well, I should say never. They would get in trouble if they had like a ghetto, right, crema party, like SAE did at Clemson. So at least in terms of that imperative indicative category, which we're actually infusing into the text, right? When we sort of introduce those distinctions, I think we've already lost part of the battle. What does it mean for us to actually not care about these things? And actually, this is just going to sound kind of like fundy, but I mean, what would it mean for us just to love people? And not have agendas. Seriously, not have like programs and agendas, but actually love the people that you come in contact with, whether it be at Walmart or at the State House or on the soccer field. What I've seen over the years, if you look at the last century of Christian mission, when there has been agendas to reach certain demographics of people, we miss others along the way. I'm tired of it. It seems to me that the scriptures just make it a lot more easy than we make it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. As you come across people, love the heck out of them. What if we just actually kind of stopped all these programs and all these labels and things and focus on, another plug for the book in the back, a racial solidarity, where we are actually involved in thinking about the imago Dei, as Bavinck says, as something plural and corporate. So we are actually inviting people from different tribes and tongues and nations to make real contributions on the basis of the things that God has uniquely gifted them for, so that we can express a whole humanity to the world in terms of what it means to be God's people, what it means to be the people of God, what it means to bear the image of God. And so I would ask them, well, don't you want to love your neighbors? Don't you want to see the image of God on display before a watching world? Don't you want to see the world see that the gospel makes a difference? Don't you want your neighbors to ask you weird questions like, why do you have how all your friends are weird and different? Why is that? You want these things for the sake of pointing people to the work of God through the gospel. So I understand the impulse, and I think it's partly the fault of people that have made racial reconciliation and made some of these justice issues so central. So much so that even in those contexts, they don't love their neighbor. They've decided who their neighbor is, which doesn't make them any different than the people in the suburbs that they don't like. Quick story, then I get one more question. I mean, this was really, I mean, it just kind of burned in me. I won't name the church or the town, because if I do that, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I was in a city, there was a year I was in a city somewhere in America, and I'm working in a church doing youth ministry, and the church had a lot of racial reconciliation stuff going on. It was a focus of the church, and because I'm an extrovert and can talk to a tree, there were some poor white kids who lived in shacks in that area who were coming around as well. And there was this young white kid whose parents were, I mean, they were desperately poor, and he told me that his dream as a poor white kid growing up in that area was to have people cheer for him at graduation. In his high school, that was his dream. That was his dream. I'm thinking, oh, this is easy. This church has 700-800 people. This is a cake to get people to cheer when he walks across the stage, because he knew that his redneck white trash family wasn't going to show up. So I went back to the church that's all about race and justice and things like this, and told them the story. Hey, there's this white kid who needs people. They could have cared less. Didn't care at all. Now, I also saw them bend over backwards for black kids in the housing project. Same class, different part of town. And that's when I started scratching my head. Right? And so part of the reaction, I think, is that there's some church communities, some nonprofits, some missions, some conceptual frameworks have actually tried to force this down people and not made it about love. They've made it about duty. They've tried to shame people into being diverse, as opposed to infusing their entry into someone else's story who's not like them on the basis of love. So I've talked about it like this, that in the gospel we are freed up to love people who are different from us. And that's a really powerful thing. And we're freed up to do that because that's exactly what God did through Christ. Christ came to love people who were radically different from him. We sin, he doesn't. And so part of what it means to be a Jesus follower is that we are all about loving people who are not like us, which puts us in positions where we love our neighbor of different races and classes and genders and sexualities and things like that.
It's sensitive to time because I'm going to take Dr. Bradley over to a faculty meeting to talk about minority leadership in evangelical institutions in just a minute, but we have time for one more question. A couple of hands. Will.
Sorry about that. It's like both of our hands go. I really appreciate all of this, and I think it's really challenging because as somebody who's tried to stir up this race conversation with my friends and people back home, I've been trying to get them to see race. And 5 years ago, I feel like many of them would have said to me, or even now, look, well, I don't see race. I care about class, and that's kind of what I see. And so, as I hear you talking, I mean, how do we maintain this? It's race and class. Because I feel like you'll get a lot of amens from people who are really colorblind. And they're like, finally somebody's speaking our language. This is great. But in my mind, I'm like, no. I'm going to lose all the work that I invested in trying to get you to see this thing you couldn't see before. And so just any thoughts on that? How do we keep it race and class?
Right. Well, again, I mean, we talk about these things concurrently and successively all the time. We don't bifurcate the conversation. We don't settle for the binaries of just one or the other, and we talk about these things locally, right? We actually talk about these things within the context of real local histories, not simply abstractions, but real stories of real zip codes that have real histories, and that's a way to sort of raise the awareness of the histories of both race and class, which always in this country date back a century or more. And I'm just afraid that if we do one or the other, we'll just continue to do this and not get to the core issues that spill over into both. Now, for those people who say that they don't see race, you could just challenge them on it by asking them who their friends are, right? I mean, I always say, look, I mean, I can look at your wedding photo and tell whether or not you see race. I will look at the pictures on your refrigerator, and you tell me the story right there, because it's the people that you cry with, it's the people that you eat with, it's what you do through Monday and through Saturday that tell the story. It's not about who you work for or what organization you serve or things like that. It's who you're willing to submit yourself to. And so, insofar as people are resistant to embedding themselves in a local history, you got to keep putting both of these things and reminding them of those things in their face. So I often get at it this way. Imagine the person that you're most afraid of your child marrying. That's who you need to be hanging out with. If you really want to test your love for the other, imagine, because we all got one, right? Imagine the person that you like, woo, I hope they don't marry those kind of people. Whatever those people are for you, then you need to go ahead and move toward those people to sort of be freed up from the strictures of what binds you there. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Amen. Amen. You know, the gospel invites us to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind. It invites us to love our neighbor. Pretty simple, pretty old truism, but thanks for making us realize how deep, how complex, how rich, how thick that invitation is. And so let's give a word of thanks to Dr. Bradley.